My mother dropped everything for my siblings' problems, but never for mine. I wasn't there when her emergency came. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in March. My phone lit up with Mom's contact photo, the one where she's laughing at my sister's wedding, her arm around my brother's shoulder. I was standing in my kitchen making tea after a 14-hour shift at the hospital where I worked as a trauma nurse. I stared at the screen through 3 full rings before I picked up. Her voice was shaking, words tumbling over each other in panic. She'd fallen down the basement stairs. Thought her ankle was broken. Dad was traveling for work. Could I come? She needed me right now, please. I stood there in my kitchen, steam rising from the mug I just poured, and felt absolutely nothing. No rush of adrenaline, no instinct to grab my keys. I told her I couldn't come. I had plans tomorrow morning that I couldn't cancel. She should call 911 if it was really that serious. The silence on her end stretched for 5 full seconds. Then she asked me what could possibly be more important than her lying injured at the bottom of the stairs. I almost laughed. The question was so painfully ironic that I had to close my eyes against the wave of accumulated hurt washing over me. I told her she'd taught me through 32 years of experience that pretty much anything counted as more important than being there for me. So, I was just following the pattern she'd established. She started crying then, saying, this was different. This was serious. She might have really hurt herself. I agreed. It sounded serious. I said I hoped she felt better soon and ended the call. I'd been my mother's 3rd child and least important priority for as long as I could remember. My sister Veronica was the oldest, born when my parents were 23 and still figuring out adulthood together. She became Mom's companion, her mini-me, the daughter she could dress up and take shopping and confide in about marital problems that number 8-year-old should hear about. My brother Austin came 2 years later, the only boy until I arrived, and he instantly became Dad's pride and the son who could do no wrong in Mom's eyes. Then I showed up 6 years after Austin, unplanned and inconvenient, arriving just as Mom was getting her life back after the intensity of 2 small children. She'd just started a part-time job she loved, had just gotten both kids in school full-time, was finally sleeping through the night and having adult conversations. And then I came along and reset everything. I don't think she ever quite forgave me for that. Growing up, I learned early that my problems were background noise, while my siblings' issues were full-volume crises requiring immediate maternal intervention. When Veronica had friendship drama in middle school, Mom would take days off work to have long talks with her, bake her favorite cookies, even show up at school to have meetings with the guidance counselor about the social dynamics. When Austin struggled with math in high school, Mom hired him a tutor, spent hours sitting with him at the kitchen table going over homework, celebrated every improved grade like he'd won the lottery. When I broke my arm, falling off my bike at age 9, I sat in the emergency room for 3 hours with a neighbor who'd found me crying on the sidewalk because Mom was at Veronica's dance recital an hour away and didn't want to leave before the performance ended. She showed up eventually, annoyed that I'd ruined Veronica's special day by having an accident that required her attention. That pattern repeated itself in variations for the next 2 decades. When I got accepted to nursing school, Mom's response was a distracted congratulations before launching into a detailed discussion of Austin's job interview and whether she should drive to his city to help him pick out a new suit for it. When I graduated top of my class, she missed the ceremony because Veronica was having a rough week after a breakup and needed Mom to stay with her. When I got my first job at Chapel Hill Medical Center and wanted to celebrate, Mom couldn't make dinner because she was helping Austin move into a new apartment. Each individual incident had an explanation that made sense on its own. Veronica really was going through a hard time. Austin really did need help, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. I learned that my achievements didn't warrant celebration and my struggles didn't warrant support. I became self-sufficient out of necessity, never calling home with problems because I knew the response would be distracted sympathy followed by a subject change to whatever crisis Veronica or Austin was currently experiencing. I stopped expecting my mother to show up for me in any meaningful way. The expectation was so deeply internalized that I didn't even consciously notice it anymore until the pattern became impossible to ignore. That shift happened about 3 years ago when I started seeing Dr. Linda Brennan, a therapist specializing in family systems and childhood emotional neglect. I'd initially gone to her for help managing work stress, but within 3 sessions, she'd identified the core issue wasn't my job. It was my family dynamics and the deep wound of never being prioritized by the parent who should have loved me unconditionally. Dr. Brennan asked me during our 4th session to describe the last time my mother had dropped everything to help me with something. I sat in her office, sun streaming through the windows and genuinely couldn't think of a single example, not one time in 32 years where my crisis had taken precedence over my siblings' needs or even over my mother's own convenience. Dr. Brennan asked if I'd ever directly told my mother how her favoritism affected me. I said I'd tried a few times when I was younger, but she'd always dismissed it as me being overly sensitive or jealous of my siblings. She'd say she loved all her children equally, and I was imagining preferential treatment. She'd point out all the things she did for me, conveniently, ignoring that those things were the bare minimum obligations she'd do while enthusiastically going above and beyond for Veronica and Austin. Dr. Brennan suggested I start documenting the pattern, not to build a case against my mother, but to validate my own reality. She said, children of emotionally neglectful parents often gaslight themselves into thinking the neglect wasn't that bad, minimizing their own hurt to maintain the relationship. The documentation would serve as objective proof that my feelings were based in consistent behavioral patterns, not imagination or oversensitivity. I started keeping notes on my phone, just brief entries marking times when the preferential treatment was obvious. Within 2 months, I had 43 documented incidents. By 6 months, I'd stopped counting because the pattern was so clear and repetitive that continuing to document it felt masochistic. The entries read like a catalog of casual dismissal. March 15th, called mom to tell her I'd been selected for a prestigious fellowship program at the hospital, a huge career achievement that would position me for leadership roles. She congratulated me briefly, then spent 35 minutes talking about Veronica's redecorating project and asking my opinion on paint colors. Never asked a single follow-up question about my fellowship. April 2nd, invited mom to a hospital fundraiser where I was being honored for my work in the pediatric trauma unit. She said she'd try to make it, then called the day before to say she'd committed to helping Austin paint his living room that weekend and couldn't back out. Suggested I send her pictures from the event. April 29th, told mom I was struggling with insomnia and anxiety, feeling burnt out from the intensity of trauma work. She suggested I try meditation and cutting back on coffee, then pivoted to discussing Veronica's promotion and how proud she was. May 18th, asked mom if she could come stay with me for a few days after I had minor surgery to remove a cyst. She said Austin's girlfriend was having a birthday party that weekend and she'd already offered to help with setup and catering. Suggested I hire a home health aide if I needed assistance. The pattern was so consistent it became almost predictable. Anytime I needed support, there was always a reason mom couldn't provide it. And that reason always involved my siblings needing her for something objectively less urgent than whatever I was facing. Dr. Brennan called it differential investment. A pattern where parents unconsciously or consciously allocate their emotional resources unevenly among children, creating a hierarchy of importance. I was at the bottom of that hierarchy and had been my entire life. The breaking point, the incident that crystallized everything and made ignoring the pattern impossible, happened on a Wednesday in September, about 18 months ago. I'd been working in the trauma unit for 6 years and had seen horrible things, but this shift was particularly brutal. We had a 7-car pileup on the highway, multiple critical patients coming in simultaneously, and I'd spent 9 straight hours in the organized chaos of trying to save lives. We lost 2 patients, including a 6-year-old girl whose injuries were too severe despite our best efforts. Her mother's scream when we told her is a sound that still haunts me. I left the hospital at 11 p.m. absolutely shattered emotionally and physically. I'd been on my feet for 14 hours, skipped meal, watched a child die, and consoled her devastated family. I called my mom from the parking lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I didn't even know what I needed from her. Just some acknowledgement that I'd been through something traumatic, some motherly comfort that would help me process the horror of the day. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. I told her about the accident, about the little girl, about how I couldn't get the image of her mother's face out of my head. Mom made sympathetic sounds and said that must have been really hard. Then there was a pause and she said she actually couldn't talk long because she was at Veronica's house helping her organize a baby shower for her best friend. The shower was in 2 days and there was still so much to do. Could we talk later? I sat in my car in that parking lot, streetlights casting orange shadows, and something fundamental broke inside me. My mother was helping my sister organize a party for someone else's baby while I was falling apart after watching a child die. The juxtaposition was so stark, so perfectly emblematic of our entire relationship that I couldn't rationalize it away anymore. I couldn't tell myself I was being too sensitive or that mom was just busy. This was who she was. This was who she'd always been. Someone who showed up enthusiastically for my siblings' peripheral concerns while treating my genuine trauma as an inconvenience that interrupted her real priorities. I told her not to worry about calling back. I said I needed to go and ended the call. Then I sat in my car for another 20 minutes watching people come and go from the hospital. Doctors and nurses and visitors and patients, all of them strangers who felt more connected to me in that moment than my own mother did. I called Dr. Brennan's emergency line even though it was late. She called me back within 10 minutes, her voice calm and professional. I told her what happened and she said something that shifted my entire perspective. She said, "Your mother has spent your whole life training you not to need her. She's succeeded. The question is whether you want to keep pretending that's acceptable or whether you're ready to acknowledge the truth of what she's done and how it's damaged you." I realized in that moment that I'd been complicit in my own neglect. By never demanding that mom show up for me, by always being understanding and accommodating and self-sufficient, I'd made it easy for her to invest all her emotional energy in my siblings while giving me scraps. I'd enabled the pattern by never calling it out clearly and never enforcing consequences when she failed me. Dr. Brennan suggested I consider setting boundaries with my mother, clearly communicating what I needed from the relationship and what I wouldn't accept anymore. She warned me that boundary setting with parents who've established long patterns of emotional neglect rarely goes well. that they often respond with defensiveness, guilt-tripping, or outright dismissal. But she said the alternative was continuing to participate in a relationship that hurt me while pretending everything was fine. I decided to try one more time to make my mother understand, to give her the opportunity to acknowledge what she'd been doing and commit to changing. I drafted an email because I knew if I tried to have this conversation verbally, she'd interrupt, deflect, and turn it into a discussion of my oversensitivity rather than her behavior. The email was 4 pages long. I detailed specific incidents spanning 20 years, not to attack her, but to show the pattern clearly. I explained how her differential treatment had affected me, how I'd learned not to rely on her, how I'd felt invisible and unimportant my entire life. I acknowledged that I didn't think she was doing this maliciously, that it might be unconscious favoritism, but that the impact on me was real regardless of intent. I asked her to consider going to family therapy with me so we could work on building a healthier relationship where I actually felt valued as her son. I sent the email on a Sunday night and spent the next 3 days checking my phone obsessively, waiting for her response. It came on Wednesday afternoon. A 6-sentence reply that managed to be both dismissive and guilt-inducing. She said she was sorry I felt that way, but she'd always loved all her children equally and done her best. She said it hurt her that I was accusing her of being a bad mother when she'd sacrificed so much to raise 3 kids. She said maybe I should focus more on being grateful for what I had instead of keeping score of perceived slight. She declined the therapy suggestion, saying she didn't need professional help to understand her own family. And that was it. No acknowledgement of specific incidents, no curiosity about my perspective, no willingness to examine her behavior, just denial and deflection, and a subtle suggestion that I was the problem for noticing the pattern she'd established. I showed Dr. Brennan the email exchange in our next session. She read both my message and Mom's response carefully, then looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and professional assessment. She said my mother's response was textbook defensive avoidance from a parent confronted with uncomfortable truths about their parenting. She said the fact that Mom had reduced my detailed, vulnerable accounting of decades of hurt to accusations of her being a bad mother showed how unwilling she was to actually hear what I was saying. Dr. Brennan asked what I wanted to do with this information. I said I didn't know. Cutting off contact with my mother felt too extreme, but continuing to invest in a relationship where I'd never be a priority felt masochistic. Dr. Brennan suggested a third option, pulling back significantly without completely severing contact, creating enough distance to protect myself while maintaining minimal connection out of obligation rather than hope. She called it strategic disengagement. The idea was to stop offering my mother opportunities to disappoint me by no longer expecting her to show up, no longer sharing important things with her, no longer participating in the fiction that we had a close mother-son relationship. I'd be polite and civil at family gatherings, remember her birthday, send the obligatory Mother's Day card, but I wouldn't invest emotionally anymore. I wouldn't call her with problems or achievements. Wouldn't expect her at important events. Wouldn't count on her for support. I'd treat her the way you'd treat a distant relative you see occasionally out of obligation. Friendly but not intimate. It sounded cold when Dr. Brennan described it, but it also sounded like relief. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment was exhausting, and the idea of simply opting out of that cycle felt like setting down a heavy weight I'd been carrying for 3 decades. I implemented the strategic disengagement gradually over the following month. I stopped calling Mom except to return her calls, and even then, I kept conversations brief and surface level. When she'd ask how I was doing, I'd say fine and pivot to asking about her or the family. When she'd mention Veronica or Austin's latest drama, I'd make appropriate sympathetic sounds without offering any comparable information about my own life. I stopped inviting her to things, stopped expecting her presence at anything important. When I got a major promotion at the hospital to Director of Trauma Services, I didn't tell her. She found out 3 weeks later through Veronica, who'd heard it from a mutual family friend. Mom called me sounding hurt, asking why I hadn't shared such big news. I said I'd been busy and it hadn't come up in our conversations. She said she would have loved to celebrate with me. I said that was nice of her to say. The conversation ended awkwardly, and I felt nothing but a mild satisfaction that she'd experienced a fraction of the exclusion I'd felt my entire life. Around the same time, I started building a life where my mother's absence didn't leave a gap. I invested more in friendships, particularly with my colleague and close friend, Jerome Whitfield, who'd become something of a brother figure. Jerome was a physician in the ER who'd worked with me for 4 years. He'd noticed my family dynamics during a hospital holiday party where my mother had spent the entire event talking to other people about Veronica's pregnancy while barely acknowledging my presence as the actual hospital employee who'd invited her. Jerome had pulled me aside after and asked if my family always treated me like furniture. The blunt question had startled me, but his directness was refreshing. We'd become close after that, and he'd been invaluable in helping me process the family stuff with the kind of honest feedback that didn't pull punches. Jerome's approach to my mother's situation was simpler than Dr. Brennan's therapeutic framework. He said my mom was a narcissist who'd picked favorites among her kids, and I'd lost that lottery. He said I could spend years trying to get her to acknowledge it, or I could accept that she was incapable of seeing her own behavior and move on. He suggested I think of her the way I'd think of a patient with a condition that couldn't be cured. Manage the symptoms, but don't expect recovery. The medical metaphor worked for me. I started thinking of my mother's favoritism as a chronic condition that was part of who she was, not something I could fix through better communication or changed behavior on my part. The shift in mindset helped. I stopped feeling hurt when she chose my siblings over me because I'd stopped expecting anything different. When she missed my 30th birthday dinner because Austin needed help moving furniture, I felt annoyed at the inconvenience of having to adjust the reservation, but not devastated by her absence. When she forgot to call on my birthday the following year because she was busy planning Veronica's baby shower, I noticed it, but didn't particularly care. The emotional detachment I'd cultivated was working. I was protecting myself by simply no longer being invested in whether my mother showed up for me. The question I couldn't answer was whether this counted as healing or just successful avoidance. Dr. Brennan said both could be true simultaneously, that sometimes protecting yourself from ongoing harm was the healthiest choice, even if it meant accepting a sad reality about your family. She said I was grieving the mother I'd needed and never had, and that grief could coexist with the practical decision to stop seeking something from someone incapable of providing it. The real test of my strategic disengagement came about 8 months ago when I had a serious health scare. I'd been experiencing severe abdominal pain for weeks. Initially dismissing it as stress or bad diet. When it got bad enough that I couldn't work through it, I finally went to my primary care physician, Dr. Angela Foster, who'd been my doctor for 6 years. She ordered a CT scan and found a mass on my pancreas that needed immediate investigation. The radiologist flagged it as concerning for malignancy, which in medical terms meant they thought it might be cancer. Dr. Foster referred me to an oncologist and a surgeon for urgent consultations. The time frame between finding the mass and getting biopsy results was 2 weeks of absolute terror. Pancreatic cancer has one of the worst prognosis of any cancer. If that's what this was, my survival odds were grim. I was 32 years old and potentially facing a death sentence. Jerome came with me to every appointment, taking notes, asking questions, making sure I understood all the medical information being thrown at me. He cleared his schedule to be available whenever I needed him, and his presence was the only thing that kept me from completely falling apart during those 2 weeks. I didn't tell my mother, not because I was punishing her or making a point, but because I genuinely didn't think of her as someone who would provide useful support during a crisis. The strategic disengagement had worked so well that she'd simply stopped being a person I turned to when I needed help. Jerome asked me several times if I was sure I didn't want to tell her, saying that whatever our issues, this was serious enough that she deserved to know. I said she'd find out if the biopsy came back positive and I actually had cancer. Until then, I didn't see the point in involving her just so she could offer distracted sympathy before returning to whatever Veronica or Austin needed from her. The biopsy came back benign. The mass was a rare type of non-cancerous growth that still required surgical removal, but wasn't going to kill me. The relief was overwhelming, though the surgery itself was still major, requiring a partial pancreatomy and several weeks of recovery. Jerome insisted on being my medical proxy and primary caretaker during recovery, refusing to let me hire a home health aide when I had friends who actually cared about me. The surgery was scheduled for mid-October, about 6 weeks before that Friday night when my mother would call me from the bottom of her basement stairs. I took medical leave from the hospital, had the surgery, and spent the next month recovering at home with Jerome checking on me daily, bringing meals, helping me manage the pain and the practical challenges of post-surgical life. Other colleagues from the hospital visited regularly, bringing books and food and company. My girlfriend Rebecca, who I'd been dating for 8 months, essentially moved in to help with my care. I was surrounded by people who showed up for me without being asked, who prioritized my recovery, who treated my health crisis as actually important. And through all of it, my mother had no idea I'd been sick. She called me twice during my recovery, both times leaving voicemails about family stuff. Once to say that Veronica had gone into early labor and delivered a healthy baby girl, asking if I could visit them in the hospital. Once to ask if I'd be coming to Austin's birthday dinner at her house the following weekend. I didn't return either call. I was busy being cared for by people who'd actually earned that role in my life. When I finally felt well enough to resume normal activities about 5 weeks post-surgery, I called my mother back. She answered sounding cheerful and immediately launched into an update about Veronica's baby and how exhausting but wonderful new grandmotherhood was. I let her talk for several minutes before mentioning casually that I'd had surgery and was recovering well. There was a pause. Then she asked what kind of surgery. I explained about the pancreatic mass, the biopsy, the operation. Her voice shifted to shocked concern. She asked when this had happened. I gave her the dates. She asked why I hadn't told her. I said I'd had people taking care of me and didn't need to worry her. She said she was my mother and of course she would have wanted to be there. I said that was nice of her to say. She pushed back asking if I was punishing her for something by excluding her from something this serious. I said I wasn't punishing anyone. I'd just learned not to expect her to show up for my problems. So, I'd stopped asking. She started to argue, but I cut her off, saying I needed to rest and would talk to her later. I ended the call and felt a grim satisfaction at reversing the dynamic for once. My mother called back the next day and the day after, leaving increasingly upset voicemails saying we needed to talk about what was happening between us. She said she felt blindsided by my anger and didn't understand where this was coming from. She wanted to have a conversation where I explained what I was so upset about so she could defend herself. The language she used was telling. Defend herself, as if my feelings were an attack rather than a reasonable response to decades of neglect. I didn't return those calls. Dr. Brennan and I discussed the situation in our next session, and she asked if I felt I owed my mother an explanation or conversation about the shift in our relationship. I said I'd already tried to explain in the email I'd sent months ago, and she dismissed everything I'd said. I didn't see the point in rehashing it just so she could defend her behavior again. Dr. Brennan pointed out that my mother might genuinely not understand what she'd done wrong, that her defensiveness came from a place of real confusion because she didn't see her differential treatment of her children as favoritism. She suggested that some people are so locked into their own narrative that they literally cannot process information that contradicts it. My mother's narrative was that she was a good mother who loved all her children equally. Any evidence suggesting otherwise had to be rejected or reframed to protect that narrative. Dr. Brennan said I had two choices. I could try one more time to break through that defensive wall with such undeniable clarity that Mom couldn't dismiss it. Or I could accept that she was never going to acknowledge what she'd done and focus on my own healing rather than trying to get her to understand. I chose the second option. I'd spent 32 years trying to get my mother to see me as worth prioritizing. I was done with that exhausting and futile effort. The months between my surgery and that Friday night in March were marked by increasing distance between my mother and me. She'd try to call. I'd occasionally answer, but keep conversations brief and impersonal. She'd invite me to family gatherings. I'd often decline or show up late and leave early. She'd ask what was wrong. I'd say nothing was wrong. I was just busy with work. She'd tried to guilt me by saying she missed her son. I'd say that was nice and change the subject. Veronica and Austin started noticing the shift and asking questions. Veronica called me one evening ostensibly to tell me about the baby, but really to probe about why I was being distant with Mom. She said Mom was really hurt and confused, that I was being unfair by freezing her out without explanation. I asked Veronica if she remembered the time Mom missed my nursing school graduation to stay with her during a breakup. Veronica said vaguely that she remembered Mom mentioning something about that, but she'd been in a really bad place emotionally at the time. I asked if she thought a breakup was more important than her brother's college graduation. She said that wasn't fair. Mom had been trying to support both of us and had to make a choice. I said exactly. She'd had to make a choice and she'd consistently chosen Veronica and Austin over me for 3 decades. Veronica got defensive, saying I was exaggerating and being dramatic. She said, Mom loved all of us and I was creating problems by keeping score of who got more attention. I asked her how many times Mom had missed her important events to help me with something. She couldn't name any. I asked her how many times Mom had dropped everything to help her with crises. She listed several without even having to think about it. I said that disparity wasn't in my imagination. It was documented reality. Veronica said I was being vindictive and that family was supposed to forgive and move on. I said I had moved on. I'd just moved on without expecting Mom to be someone she'd never been. Veronica hung up on me and I added her to the list of family members I'd strategically disengaged from. Austin's approach was different, but equally unhelpful. He called and tried to mediate, saying he understood I had issues with Mom, but could I at least pretend everything was fine for her sake? He said she was getting older and stressed and didn't need family drama. I pointed out that I wasn't creating drama. I was simply opting out of a relationship that had always been one-sided. Austin said he'd never noticed Mom treating me differently, that from his perspective, she'd been equally involved with all of us. I asked if he remembered the time I broke my arm and sat in the ER with a neighbor because Mom was at Veronica's dance recital. He said he vaguely remembered something about that, but I was a kid and kids get hurt all the time. I said I was 9 years old with a compound fracture and our mother chose a dance recital over her injured son. Austin said I was cherry-picking incidents to build a case against Mom. I said I had 43 documented incidents from the past 2 years alone. That wasn't cherry-picking. That was a pattern. Austin said, documentation sounded obsessive and maybe I should talk to a therapist about my need to villainize our mother. I said I'd been in therapy for 2 years and my therapist agreed that Mom's behavior constituted emotional neglect. Austin said he wasn't going to engage with this anymore, that if I wanted to destroy my relationship with Mom over perceived slights from childhood, that was my choice, but he wasn't going to participate in it. He hung up and I realized that my entire family had invested in the fiction that Mom was equally devoted to all her children, and my refusal to maintain that fiction made me the problem. They needed to believe she was a good mother who'd done her best, and I was threatening that belief by pointing out the obvious truth that she'd played favorites. It was easier to dismiss me as oversensitive than to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality. By the time that Friday night in March arrived, I'd been essentially estranged from my mother for months. We'd exchange brief pleasantries if we happened to be at the same family function, but we had no real relationship. She'd stopped trying to call regularly after I'd failed to return her calls so many times. Veronica and Austin had accepted that I was no longer an active participant in family dynamics and had stopped trying to bridge the gap. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd cut off my family over nothing. Just a sensitive guy who couldn't handle normal family imperfection. But from the inside, it felt like I'd finally stopped participating in a system designed to keep me in a subordinate position. I'd finally stopped seeking crumbs of maternal attention from someone constitutionally incapable of giving me the full meal my siblings received. The night she called from the basement, I was genuinely unprepared for the conversation. I'd spent months training myself not to respond to her, not to feel obligated to help her, not to drop everything the way she'd always expected me to drop everything for her convenience. So when she called injured and alone and needing me, my first instinct wasn't compassion. It was cold recognition of the irony. For the first time in 32 years, she needed me to show up for her genuine emergency. And I chose not to, the same way she'd chosen not to show up for mine countless times. After I ended that call, I stood in my kitchen finishing my tea, expecting to feel guilty or conflicted. Instead, I felt calm, resolved, like I'd finally enforced a boundary that should have been established decades ago. My phone started ringing again almost immediately. First, my mother calling back, which I didn't answer. Then, Veronica calling, which I also ignored. Then, Austin. Then a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be my father calling from his business trip after my mother had managed to reach him in a panic. I answered Dad's call on the fourth ring. He sounded stressed, asking if I'd talked to Mom. I said briefly, yes. He said she told him I'd refused to help her after she'd fallen down the stairs and injured herself. Was that true? I said, yes, that was accurate. There was a pause. And then Dad asked, what the hell was wrong with me? His voice had the edge it got when he was genuinely angry, which was rare. I explained calmly that Mom had established a 32-year pattern of not being available for my emergencies, so I was simply following the precedent she'd set. Dad said this wasn't the time for whatever grudge I was holding, that Mom was hurt and alone, and I needed to get over there immediately. I said she should call 911 if it was serious enough to require immediate help. Dad said he couldn't believe I was being this petty and vindictive, that this wasn't how he'd raised. I pointed out that he'd been largely absent for most of my childhood, working long hours and traveling for business, so he didn't have much standing to comment on how I'd been raised or how the family dynamics had played out. He said that was a low blow and I was acting like a spoiled child. I said I was acting exactly how Mom had taught me to act, prioritizing my own convenience over someone else's emergency. If that seemed wrong to him, maybe he should examine why it had been acceptable when she did it to me, but unacceptable when I did it to her. Dad said he didn't have time for this psychological analysis. He was booking the next flight home, but it would be 4 hours minimum before he could get there. He needed me to go check on Mom right now. I said no. Dad said he was serious. This wasn't negotiable. I said it actually was negotiable. I was an adult making my own choices and I chose not to help her. Dad said I'd regret this, that there were some lines you don't cross with family. I said Mom had crossed those lines with me for 3 decades and I'd finally learned the lesson she'd been teaching. Dad hung up on me without another word. I sat down on my couch and opened my laptop, half expecting to feel remorse or doubt about my decision. Instead, I felt a strange kind of clarity. This was the culmination of years of accumulated hurt, and I'd finally stopped absorbing that hurt silently. I'd finally enforced a consequence for behavior that should have had consequences all along. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts. Veronica sent a long text saying I was being cruel and heartless, that Mom could be seriously injured, that I was putting my ego ahead of basic human decency. Austin sent a shorter message saying he'd always known I was selfish, but this was a new low. I blocked both of them and turned off notifications. Around 1 a.m., I got a call from a number with a local area code. I answered out of curiosity and a woman identified herself as Jennifer Morrison from Mercy Hospital ER. She said my mother had been brought in by ambulance with a suspected ankle fracture and contusions from a fall. My mother had given them my number as her emergency contact. They needed to admit her overnight for observation because she'd hit her head during the fall and was showing signs of a mild concussion. Did I want to come to the hospital? I asked if she was in stable condition. Jennifer confirmed she was stable but would need someone to pick her up when she was discharged, likely tomorrow afternoon. I said I wouldn't be available to pick her up. She should call one of my siblings or a friend. Jennifer sounded surprised, asking if I was sure, noting that I was listed as the primary emergency contact. I said my mother had other children who were better positioned to help and ended the call. I slept remarkably well that night, better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and a flood of text messages from family members, extended relatives who'd apparently been mobilized to guilt me into compliance. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, called at 8 a.m. and I made the mistake of answering. She launched into an aggressive lecture about family obligation and how disappointed she was in me. She said my mother had always spoken so highly of me, and this was how I repaid her, by abandoning her when she needed help. I asked Aunt Carol if Mom had mentioned that she'd missed my father's heart attack to help my sister's friend with interview prep. Aunt Carol said she didn't know what I was talking about and it wasn't relevant to the current situation. I said it was entirely relevant because it established a pattern of Mom not showing up for emergencies that inconvenienced her. Aunt Carol said I was twisting things and being manipulative. I said I was being consistent. Aunt Carol said she'd always thought I was the good son, the responsible one, and this behavior was completely out of character. I said maybe she'd never actually known my character because she'd only seen the version I presented at family gatherings where I played my role in the family fiction. She said I needed therapy, that I was clearly having some kind of breakdown. I said I'd been in therapy for 2 years and was healthier now than I'd ever been. She hung up on me. Within an hour, I'd received similar calls from 2 cousins and my grandmother, all of them expressing shock and disappointment at my refusal to help my injured mother. None of them had apparently ever noticed the decades of differential treatment that led to this moment. They only saw my current refusal, which looked cruel without context. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize and put my phone on Do Not Disturb mode. The isolation felt good. I spent the day cleaning my apartment, meal prepping for the week, going to the gym, normal Saturday activity, uninterrupted by family drama. Sunday morning, Veronica showed up at my apartment unannounced. I saw her through the peephole and considered not opening the door, but curiosity won out. She looked exhausted, bags under her eyes, her hair in a messy ponytail. She pushed past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation and turned to face me with her arms crossed. She said Mom was being discharged in 2 hours and Dad was stuck in Dallas due to weather delays. His flight kept getting pushed back. Austin was out of state for a work conference. That meant Veronica had to pick Mom up and help her get settled at home, and she had a 6-month-old baby at home with her husband who had to work this afternoon. She needed me to either pick up Mom or come watch the baby while she dealt with Mom. I said I wasn't available for either task. Veronica said I was being ridiculous and selfish. I said I was being consistent with the family values Mom had modeled my entire life. Veronica said she didn't have time for my victim complex. That Mom had done her best raising 3 kids and I needed to get over whatever perceived slights I was holding on to. I asked Veronica point blank if she honestly thought Mom had treated all of us equally. She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw that she knew the truth. She'd always known. She said slowly that Mom had connected with her more easily because they had similar personalities and that Mom and Austin had bonded over his sports and activities, but that didn't mean Mom loved me less. I asked if love without action meant anything. If Mom loved me but never showed up for me, never prioritized my needs, never made me feel important, what did that love actually consist of? Veronica said she didn't know how to answer that. I said exactly because there wasn't a good answer. Mom's love for me was theoretical, something she claimed to feel but never demonstrated. Veronica said this conversation wasn't solving the immediate problem of who was picking up Mom. I said that was Veronica's problem to solve, not mine. She left without another word. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Austin saying that Veronica had picked up Mom and gotten her settled at home. Mom had a severe ankle sprain, not a fracture, and a mild concussion. She'd be on crutches for a few weeks and needed help with daily activities. The family had decided to rotate, staying with her until Dad got back, which should be Monday evening. Austin said pointedly that he and Veronica would handle it since I'd made clear I wasn't willing to help family in crisis. I didn't respond to the text. Monday came and I returned to work at the hospital, jumping back into the controlled chaos of the trauma unit. Several colleagues asked about my weekend and I gave vague positive answers. Jerome pulled me aside during a break and asked directly if everything was okay, noting that I seemed tense. I told him about the situation with my mother, expecting him to be shocked or judgmental. Instead, he nodded slowly and said it sounded like I'd finally stopped setting myself on fire to keep her warm. He asked if I felt guilty. I said I kept expecting to feel guilty, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of caring about someone who'd never cared about me the same way. Jerome said that was probably healthy. That guilt would have meant I still bought into the idea that I owed her something despite her never reciprocating. He said family obligation was only obligation if it ran both directions. Having someone validate that my response was reasonable rather than cruel made it easier to sit with my decision. Over the next few weeks, I maintained my distance from my family. Dad called once after he got home, ostensibly to check on me, but really to lecture about my behavior. I let him talk, offered no defense or explanation, and ended the call when he started repeating himself. Mom never called directly, but I heard through the family grapevine that she was telling people she didn't understand what she'd done to make me so angry. She was apparently playing the confused, hurt mother, bewildered by her son's sudden cruelty. The reckoning came about a month after the basement incident. Veronica called and asked if I'd meet her for coffee. Just the 2 of us, no ambush from other family members. I agreed out of curiosity, more than any real desire to reconcile. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, neutral territory. Veronica looked better than she had when she'd shown up at my door, more put together, though still tired in the way all new mothers are. We ordered drinks and sat at a corner table, She started by saying she'd been thinking a lot about our last conversation, particularly my question about whether love without action meant anything. She said she'd talked to her husband about it, and he'd pointed out some things she hadn't wanted to see, specifically that she'd always known Mom treated me differently, but had benefited from the differential treatment, so she'd never questioned it. She'd received the majority of Mom's attention and support, and it had been convenient to tell herself that I didn't mind or that I was just more independent. But watching me completely withdraw from the family had forced her to reconsider whether my independence had been a choice or a coping mechanism. I didn't say anything, just waited to see where she was going with this. Veronica said she'd started paying attention to how Mom talked about me versus how she talked about her and Austin. She said she'd noticed that when I accomplished something or faced a challenge, Mom's response was brief and distracted before she'd pivot to discussing Veronica or Austin. She'd noticed that Mom never called just to check on me the way she called to check on them. She'd noticed that Mom's entire identity as a mother seemed built around her relationships with her and Austin, with me as an afterthought. She said watching these patterns as an adult was different than not noticing them as a kid. She could see now what I'd been trying to tell her, that Mom had favorites and I wasn't one of them. I asked Veronica why she was telling me this now. She said because she owed me an apology for dismissing my feelings and participating in the family's gaslighting of my reality. She said she'd been complicit in my neglect by never calling it out, never standing up for me, never demanding that Mom treat me better. She'd accepted the benefits of being the favorite child without considering the cost to me. She said she was sorry and she understood if I didn't want a relationship with her anymore either. The apology felt genuine and I appreciated it, but it also felt insufficient. 3 decades of neglect couldn't be undone with one coffee shop conversation and an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I told Veronica I appreciated her recognizing the pattern, but I didn't know if that changed anything between us. Our relationship had always been shaped by the family dynamics with her in the position of the valued child and me as the overlooked one. I wasn't sure we knew how to relate to each other outside those roles. Veronica said she wanted to try if I was willing. She said she'd been a bad sister by passively accepting Mom's favoritism and she wanted to do better. I said I'd think about it. We finished our coffee making awkward small talk about her baby and my work. When we parted ways, she hugged me and said she hoped I'd give her a chance to prove she could be better. I said I'd be in touch. The conversation left me feeling unsettled. Part of me wanted to accept Veronica's olive branch and try to build a healthier relationship with at least one member of my family. But another part of me recognized that one apology didn't undo a lifetime of complicity. Veronica had been an adult for over a decade and had never once questioned why Mom treated me so differently until I'd forced the issue by withdrawing completely. That kind of willful blindness didn't reverse overnight. About 2 weeks after my conversation with Veronica, I got an unexpected call from Dr. Brennan asking if I could come in for an emergency session. I'd been seeing her weekly for over 2 years, and she'd never requested an emergency session before. So, I cleared my schedule and went to her office that afternoon. She was waiting with a serious expression and a file folder on her desk. She said she'd received a call that morning from my mother, who'd somehow found her contact information and wanted to schedule a session to discuss me. Dr. Brennan had declined, citing client confidentiality, but my mother had been insistent, saying she was desperate to understand what she'd done wrong and how to fix her relationship with her son. Dr. Brennan said she'd explained that she couldn't discuss me with anyone without my explicit permission, but Mom had asked if she'd at least relay a message. Against her better judgment, Dr. Brennan had agreed to share that my mother wanted to attend family therapy if I'd be willing, that she recognized there were problems in our relationship, even if she didn't fully understand them, and that she missed me. Dr. Brennan asked what I wanted to do with this information. I said I wasn't interested in family therapy with my mother. Dr. Brennan asked why. I said, because I'd already tried to communicate clearly about the problems in our relationship through that email months ago, and she'd dismissed everything. Family therapy would just be another forum for her to defend herself and avoid accountability. Dr. Brennan pointed out that people can change, that Mom reaching out showed some level of awareness, that there was a problem, even if she didn't fully grasp what it was. She asked if I was willing to consider the possibility that Mom might be capable of growth if given the right support and structure. I said, honestly, I didn't care whether she was capable of growth. I'd spent 32 years hoping she'd change, and she'd consistently proven she wouldn't. I was done hoping. I'd rather have no relationship than continue the exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment. Dr. Brennan looked at me thoughtfully and said something that hit hard. She said it sounded like I'd given up on my mother entirely, which was my right and might even be the healthiest choice. But she wanted me to consider whether I'd given up because I genuinely didn't care about having a relationship with her or because I was protecting myself from caring by preemptively cutting off any possibility of reconciliation. She said the two motivations looked similar on the surface but came from very different places emotionally. If I didn't care, then walking away was clean and complete. But if I was protecting myself from caring, then I was still controlled by the relationship even in its absence. The distinction mattered because one led to peace and the other led to ongoing internal conflict. I sat with that question for several days. Did I genuinely not want a relationship with my mother, or was I just protecting myself from wanting something I'd never get? The answer was complicated. There was a part of me that would always want the mother I'd needed. The one who showed up enthusiastically for my achievements and supported me through crisis. But that mother didn't exist and never had. The actual mother I had was someone who loved me in abstract but not in practice. Who'd consistently chosen my siblings over me, who dismissed my hurt when confronted with it. I didn't want a relationship with that person, but I grieved the relationship I'd never have with the mother I'd needed. The grief and the disinterest coexisted, and I realized I needed to accept both as valid. I could mourn what I'd never had while also choosing to stop pursuing it. Dr. Brennan said that sounded like a healthy integration of competing feelings. She asked if I wanted to send any message back to my mother through her. I thought about it and said yes. I wanted Dr. Brennan to tell my mother that I appreciated her reaching out, but I wasn't interested in family therapy or in rebuilding our relationship at this time. I needed space to focus on my own healing without the added pressure of managing her feelings about our relationship. If she genuinely wanted to understand what she'd done wrong, she could reread the email I'd sent her months ago with fresh eyes and actual openness to hearing difficult truths. If she did that work on her own, maybe someday in the future, we could revisit the idea of limited contact. But for now, I needed distance. Dr. Brennan said she'd relay that message and respect whatever boundaries I chose to set. I never heard whether Dr. Brennan delivered that message or how my mother responded to it. The silence itself felt like an answer. If Mom had been genuinely committed to understanding and change, she would have found a way to communicate that to me directly. The fact that she didn't suggested that her outreach to my therapist had been performative, a way to tell herself and others that she'd tried to fix things when I was the one being unreasonable. The interpretation was cynical, but it was supported by 32 years of evidence about who she was and how she operated. Life continued without my family in it. I threw myself into work, got promoted again to associate director of the entire emergency department. My relationship with Rebecca deepened and we moved in together. Jerome and I started teaching a trauma response course for nursing students at the university. I built a full, meaningful life with people who actually showed up for me, who prioritized me the way I prioritized them, who treated relationships as reciprocal rather than one-directional. The absence of my mother and siblings left a hole, but it was the kind of hole you feel when you remove something toxic, painful in the short term, but healing in the long term. I thought about my mother sometimes, wondered how she was doing, whether she'd ever actually processed what I'd tried to tell her, but I didn't reach out, and she didn't either. The silence between us became permanent, and I made peace with that permanence. 6 months after that night, when she'd called from the bottom of the stairs, I saw her at my cousin's wedding. It was unavoidable. We were both invited, and I couldn't reasonably skip it. She was there with Dad, Veronica, Austin, and Veronica's baby. She looked older, grayer, moving carefully on the ankle she'd injured. When she saw me, her face lit up with hope, and she started to approach. I turned and walked in the other direction, finding sanctuary with Rebecca and Jerome, who'd come as my guests. I watched from across the reception as Mom's face fell as she said something to Dad, who looked over at me with an expression I couldn't read. She didn't try to approach again. At one point, Veronica came over and asked if I'd at least say hello to Mom, that it was cruel to be at the same event and completely ignore her. I said Mom had spent my entire childhood ignoring my needs while being fully present for hers and Austin's. One wedding where I didn't engage with her was hardly comparable. Veronica looked hurt but didn't argue. Later, Austin cornered me by the bar and said I was being childish and punishing Mom for things she didn't even realize she'd done. I asked him if ignorance absolved someone of responsibility for harm they'd caused. He said family was supposed to forgive. I said forgiveness required acknowledgement of wrongdoing and effort to make amends, neither of which Mom had offered. Austin said I was going to regret this when she died and I'd missed years of potential relationship. I said I'd made peace with that possibility. He walked away shaking his head. The wedding ended and I went home feeling validated in my choice. Seeing my mother and siblings in person had confirmed that nothing had changed. They still saw me as the problem, the one creating conflict by refusing to pretend everything was fine. They still didn't understand or acknowledge the pattern that had brought us to this point. The lack of understanding wasn't surprising, but it was clarifying. It reminded me why distance was necessary and healthy. A few weeks after the wedding, my father called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He sounded tired, older than I remembered. He said he'd been thinking a lot about our family situation and wanted to talk without judgment or pressure. I said I was willing to listen. Dad said he'd spent the past months watching Mom struggle with my absence, watching her try to understand what went wrong. He said he'd also spent time reflecting on his own role in the family dynamics, on how his frequent absences for work had left Mom as the primary parent and him unaware of how she'd actually parented us differently. He said he'd started asking Veronica and Austin specific questions about their childhoods and comparing their experiences to what he remembered of mine. the patterns I'd described started becoming visible to him. He said he owed me an apology for not seeing it sooner and for dismissing my feelings when Mom had called from the basement. I appreciated the apology, but asked what had prompted this reflection. Dad said, honestly, it was watching Mom deteriorate emotionally, seeing her grapple with the reality that one of her children wanted nothing to do with her. He said whether or not I was justified in my distance. The pain it caused her was real, and watching it had made him want to understand how things had gotten this bad. I told Dad that Mom's pain was unfortunate, but it was the natural consequence of decades of her own choices. She'd chosen to invest more in my siblings than in me. She'd chosen to dismiss my hurt when I'd tried to communicate it. She'd chosen to prioritize her own narrative as a good mother over the actual reality of how she'd parented me. Those choices had consequences, and her current pain was one of them. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said he understood my perspective and didn't expect me to change my mind or reconcile with Mom, but he wanted me to know that he loved me and was proud of who I'd become and that he regretted not being more present when I was growing up. He said he should have noticed what was happening and intervened. Should have insisted Mom treat all of us equally. His failure to do that had contributed to the damage and he was sorry. The apology felt genuine and I told him I appreciated it. He asked if we could maintain our own relationship independent of the situation with Mom. I said I'd think about it. We talked for another 20 minutes about my work and his plans for retirement. Normal father-son conversation that had been rare in my childhood. When we hung up, I felt something shift slightly. My father wasn't responsible for my mother's favoritism, but his absence had allowed it to flourish unchecked. His acknowledgement of that failure mattered, and his willingness to maintain a relationship with me, despite the strain it might create with Mom, showed a level of prioritization I'd never experienced from him before. I decided to give him a chance to prove he meant what he said. Over the following months, Dad and I developed a tentative relationship. We'd meet for lunch every few weeks, talk on the phone occasionally. He never pressured me about Mom, never tried to mediate or fix things. He just showed up as my father in a way he never had when I was young. It didn't erase the past, but it offered something new, and I was willing to see where it led. As for my mother, I haven't spoken to her since that wedding. It's been over a year now since that Friday night when she called from the basement stairs, and I chose not to come. I still don't regret that choice. Thank you guys for watching. Peace.